Kicked out at 17, I found a Quonset hut for $6 and survived -52-degree temperatures. What I built inside of it didn't just keep me warm, it saved my life. This isn't just a story about survival, it's a story about what home really means. If you've ever felt like you were on the edge of the world, alone and out of options, stick with me. Hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. The air in the hallway of our apartment always smelled like stale cigarette smoke and boiled cabbage. On my 17th birthday, it smelled like the end of the world. My mother stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tight against her chest, a gesture that wasn't about holding herself together, but about holding me out. Her face, a place I once knew better than my own, was a mask of exhausted finality. There were no tears, no shouting. The arguments had burned out weeks ago, leaving behind only this cold, quiet ash.
"Leo, you're 17 now," she said, her voice flat, as if reading a line from a script she'd long since memorized. "You're practically a man. A man needs to make his own way." Practically. That one word hung in the air between us, a tiny, sharp-edged thing. Practically a man, practically an adult, practically no longer her problem. I had 2 duffel bags at my feet, packed with the sum total of my 17 years. Some clothes, a few worn paperbacks, a toothbrush, and the $342 I'd saved from 2 summers of part-time jobs. It felt like a fortune and nothing at all at once. I looked past her into the small living room, at the dent in the couch that was mine, at the single framed photo on the wall of me as a gap-toothed kid on my grandfather's shoulders. He was the one who had always felt like home, but he'd been gone for 5 years. Since he died, the ground beneath my feet had been slowly crumbling. Today, it had given way completely. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. The question came out as a whisper. I had hoped for more strength in my voice, but there was none left. She shrugged, a small, tired movement of her shoulders. "You're smart. You'll figure it out. It's better this way, Leo. I can't do this anymore." Her gaze flickered away toward the kitchen, toward the bottle I knew was on the counter. That was the other person in our family now, the one who had taken my place. I understood, in a dull, aching way, that this wasn't about me. Not really. It was about her, and the space she needed for her own collapse. I was just in the way. I didn't say goodbye. I just bent down, looped my fingers through the straps of the duffel bags, and straightened up. The weight of them was familiar, but it felt different today. Heavier. Permanent. I turned and walked down the hallway, the cabbage smell clinging to my clothes. I didn't look back. I was afraid that if I did, I would see nothing in the doorway. No one watching me go. And somehow, that felt worse than the eviction itself. The click of the apartment door shutting behind me was soft, but it sounded like a gunshot in the silent hall. Then there was just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the realization that I had no key to get back in. I was 17. I was homeless. And I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The first few days were a blur of motion, a frantic attempt to outrun the stillness. The stillness was where the fear lived. I stayed on buses until the last stop, nursing cold coffees in 24-hour diners, and tried to sleep sitting up in hospital waiting rooms until a security guard would gently but firmly nudge me awake and tell me I had to move on. My $342 began to evaporate. A 10 for a meal here, a 5 for a coffee there. Each bill I broke feeling like another step toward a cliff. The city I had grown up in became a hostile landscape. Every park bench looked too exposed, every alley too dangerous.
The faces of strangers, once just part of the background noise of my life, now seemed to scan me, judging my duffel bags, my tired eyes, my youth. I was a problem waiting to happen, a stray. I learned to make myself small, to look at the pavement, to become invisible. It was a lonely, exhausting kind of magic. After a week, my money was below $200. The nights were getting colder, a damp chill that promised a brutal autumn. The panic, which I had been keeping at bay with constant movement, began to creep in. It started as a tightness in my chest and grew into a full-blown certainty that I was going to fail. I would end up another statistic, another kid lost to the streets. One rainy afternoon, I took refuge in the public library. It was warm and dry, and no one bothered you if you were quiet. It smelled of old paper and floor wax, a scent of order and calm that was the opposite of everything I was feeling. I was sitting at a carrel, pretending to read a book on ancient civilizations, when a memory surfaced. It was a small, dusty thing, something my grandfather had said to me years ago. Everything important I ever owned fits in one box, Leo. Remember that. Not the junk, the important stuff. The box. It wasn't a memory. It was a fact. After he died, my mother had been ruthless in her cleaning, throwing out nearly all of his belongings. But I had saved one thing, a single battered cardboard box labeled personal. I'd paid for a tiny 5x5 storage unit for a year with money he'd left me for my birthday. I had insisted on keeping it for reasons I couldn't articulate then. It just felt wrong to let the last pieces of him disappear. The yearly fee was due at the end of the month. I had the renewal notice crumpled in my backpack. If I didn't pay, the contents would be auctioned off, sold for a few dollars to a stranger. The thought sent a jolt through me, a feeling other than fear. It was a spark of something fierce, protective. The storage facility was on the industrial edge of town, a grid of faded orange doors under a gray sky. I paid the cab driver, another $20 gone, and walked to my unit. C-17. I slid the key into the padlock. It was stiff from disuse. The metal door groaned in protest as I rolled it up, revealing a small, dark space that smelled of dust and time. There wasn't much inside. A broken lamp, a stack of my old school textbooks, and against the back wall, the box. It was just a standard moving box, sealed with yellowing tape. Personal, my grandfather had written on the side in his neat, architectural block letters. I dragged it out into the daylight and sat on the cold concrete, using my house key, now useless for any other purpose, to slice through the tape. The contents were a jumble of a life. Old photographs, mostly of a woman I assumed was my grandmother, her smile bright and genuine. His military discharge papers, a Bronze Star medal in a velvet case, its ribbon crisp. I ran my thumb over the cool metal, trying to imagine the man who had earned it. And then, at the very bottom, beneath a bundle of letters tied with twine, I found it. It wasn't a shoebox full of cash or a secret will. It was a small, heavy metal deed box, the kind you get from a bank. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid. Inside, there was no treasure, just a handful of folded, brittle documents. The top one was a quitclaim deed, dated 15 years prior. It transferred a 5-acre parcel of land in a part of Alaska I'd never even heard of, a place called Unity Point, to him. Stapled to it was a bill of sale for one government surplus Quonset hut, model QF5020, for the grand sum of $1. Pinned to that was a clerk's receipt from the local borough office for a filing fee, $5. The total cost for this strange inheritance was $6. I unfolded the last paper. It was a hand-drawn map on a piece of graph paper showing the 5-acre lot. In the middle was a rectangle with the word hut. A small X was marked near the edge of the property with a note beside it. Key in magnetic box under the old wellhead. I sat there on the concrete, the wind whipping around the corner of the storage unit, and I started to laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a wild, unhinged bark of pure absurdity. I was 17, with $150 to my name, and I had just inherited a tin can in the middle of nowhere. It was the stupidest, most insane idea in the world. It was a ghost of a plan from a dead man, and it was the only thing I had. The decision felt less like a choice and more like the only door that hadn't slammed shut in my face. Going to Alaska to claim a dilapidated metal hut on a piece of forgotten land was objectively insane. But what was the alternative? Waiting for my money to run out, and then turning myself over to social services? Becoming a ward of the state, bounced between foster homes until I turned 18, at which point I'd be kicked out all over again, but this time with nothing? The Quonset hut, as ridiculous as it was, felt like a choice I could make. It was my own mistake to make, my own disaster to navigate. That felt infinitely better than being a passive victim of someone else's. The next 48 hours were a blur of liquidation. I sold my phone for $50 at one of those corner kiosks. I sold the few decent pairs of jeans and a jacket I had to a consignment shop for another $30. I even sold the bronze star. That was the hardest part. I held the metal in my hand in the pawn shop, the fluorescent lights glinting off its surface. It felt like selling a piece of my grandfather's soul. But as the shop owner counted out $65 onto the grimy glass counter, I remembered what my grandfather had said. Everything important fits in one box. The metal was a thing. The memory of him, the legacy he was unintentionally handing me, that was what was important. I kept the box of letters and the deed. That was the real inheritance. With just over $300, I walked into the bus station. The departures board was a list of faraway places. I found the one I needed. A bus heading north, a series of transfers that would eventually, after 3 days, deposit me in a town that was the closest stop to Unity Point. The ticket agent, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, looked at my destination and then back at me. "That's a long ride, honey. You running to something or from something?" "A little of both, I guess," I said. She nodded slowly, stamped my ticket, and pushed it across the counter. "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for." The bus ride was a slow-motion dissolve of the world I knew. The first day was familiar territory, the sprawling suburbs giving way to neat farmland, the landscape green and orderly. I sat with my forehead pressed against the vibrating window, watching it all slide by. I was the youngest person on the bus by at least 20 years. The other passengers were a quiet, solitary bunch, each wrapped in their own thoughts, their own journeys. No one spoke to me. I was just another shadow in a seat. By the second day, the landscape began to change. The farms thinned out, replaced by dense forests of pine and fir. The towns we passed through got smaller, the buildings more weathered. The skies seemed to get bigger, wider, a vast canvas of gray. I read some of my grandfather's letters on the bus. They weren't addressed to me, but to my grandmother. They were love letters, but they were also survival guides. He wrote about his time after the war, about the noise in his head that never stopped. He wrote about buying the land, about the dream of building a place of absolute quiet. "The world is too loud, Mary," one letter read. "I need a place where the only sound is the wind and my own heartbeat. A place to remember how to be a person." I felt a strange kinship with this man I barely knew, this ghost writing to his ghost of a wife. I was running to the quiet, too. The third day was like entering another planet. The forests gave way to a vast, rolling tundra, broken only by stands of skeletal-looking spruce. The road straightened into a black ribbon laid across an endless expanse of brown and gray. Snow lingered in the shadows, a stark white against the muted earth tones. The air that hissed from the bus's vents grew colder. I saw a moose, a massive, dark shape moving with impossible grace on the side of the road. It looked ancient, like it belonged to the land in a way I never could. The bus was nearly empty now, just me and a few oil workers heading up to the fields. Their silence was different from the others. It was heavier, more resigned. They knew this land. They knew what it took from you. When the bus finally pulled into the station, a single-room building with a gravel parking lot, the driver announced the name of the town. It was just after dawn. The sun was a weak, pale disk in the eastern sky. I stepped off the bus, and the cold hit me like a physical blow. It was a dry, biting cold that went straight through my thin jacket and into my bones. The air was so clean, it hurt to breathe. This was it, the edge of the world. The town wasn't much of a town. It was a single main street with a dozen or so buildings, their paint peeling, their windows dark. A general store, a bar with a flickering neon sign, a post office, and a handful of houses. There was no one on the street. The only sound was the wind, a low, constant moan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I pulled my duffel bags closer and walked toward the general store, the only place that showed any signs of life. A plume of smoke rose from its chimney. Inside, it was warm and smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and dust. An old man with a face like a topographical map sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. He looked up at me over his glasses, his expression neutral, patient. He'd seen boys like me before, I realized. Lost boys who washed up here thinking it was an escape. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I'm looking for a place," I said, my own voice sounding thin and young. "Unity Point?" He raised an eyebrow, a fractional movement. "Ain't nothing at Unity Point. Hasn't been for 30 years. Just some old government parcels. Why?" I hesitated, then pulled the folded deed from my pocket and laid it on the counter. "I own one of them. A Quonset hut." He picked up the paper, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle with the brittle document. He read it, then looked back at me. The neutrality in his eyes shifted to something that might have been pity, or maybe just curiosity. "Well, I'll be. Frank Carter's place. Haven't thought about him in years. He was your grandfather?" "Yes, sir." He folded the deed and pushed it back to me. "Frank was a good man, quiet, kept to himself. That hut's been sitting empty since he passed. It's about 10 miles north of here. The old access road is probably half washed out. You got a vehicle?" "No, sir." He sighed, a long, slow exhalation. "Winter's coming on fast, son. It ain't a game up here." "I know," I said, though I didn't. Not really. "Is there anyone who might be heading that way?" He thought for a moment, then nodded toward the window. A large logging truck was idling by the gas pumps.
Mac's heading up to the north lease. He passes the turnoff. I'll talk to him,
But he'll only get you to the road. It's a 2-mile walk from there. He paused, his gaze sharp. You got proper gear? A real coat? Boots? I looked down at my worn sneakers and thin jacket. My silence was answer enough. He shook his head slowly, then disappeared into the back of the store. He returned with a pair of thick, insulated work boots and a heavy, dark green parka. They were used, but in good condition. Take these, he said, placing them on the counter. On loan. You make it through the winter, you come back and we'll settle up. You don't? Well, I guess it won't matter then. The trucker, Mac, was a mountain of a man with a kind face. He didn't ask many questions. He just cleared a space on the passenger seat and told me to hop in. The cab of the truck was high off the ground, a warm, rumbling haven. We drove in silence for 20 minutes, the truck eating up the miles of paved road. Then he slowed and turned onto a gravel track that was little more than 2 ruts in the dirt. After another 10 minutes of bouncing and jostling, he pulled over. This is it, he said, pointing ahead. Road gets rough from here. Your spot is about 2 miles in. You can't miss it. It's the only thing out there. He looked at me, a serious expression on his face. You get into real trouble, you walk south. Just keep walking. You'll hit the main road eventually. Good luck, kid. I thanked him, grabbed my bags, and slid out of the warm cab. The truck rumbled away, leaving me in a profound silence, broken only by the wind in the sparse trees. The air was colder here, away from the town. I put on the heavy parka and the boots. They were a little big, but they were warm. A lifeline from a stranger. I shouldered my bags and started walking. The road was rough, half overgrown with weeds and pitted with deep, frozen puddles. The sky was a uniform, oppressive gray. After walking for what felt like an eternity, I saw it. At the top of a low rise, silhouetted against the sky, was a shape that didn't belong. A perfect, gray metal arch. The Quonset hut. It was bigger than I had imagined, a dull metallic whale beached on a sea of brown grass and patches of old, dirty snow. It looked alien, industrial, and profoundly lonely. My heart sank. This wasn't a cozy cabin. This was a warehouse, a tomb. I walked the last few hundred yards, my new boots crunching on the frozen ground. The scale of it was intimidating. The corrugated metal walls were streaked with rust. A single, heavy metal door was set into the front. To the side, I found the old wellhead my grandfather had marked on the map, a concrete cylinder capped with a rotting wooden lid. I knelt, my fingers numb with cold, and felt around the underside of the concrete lip. My fingers brushed against a small metal box, the magnetic key holder. It was still there. Inside, a single brass key, green with verdigris. I walked back to the door, my hand trembling as I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a stiff, grinding click. I pulled the handle. The heavy door swung inward with a deep groan, the sound echoing in the vast space beyond. I stepped across the threshold, out of the wind and into the belly of the beast. The air inside was still and frigid, colder than it was outside. It smelled of rust, dust, and the faint metallic scent of mice. Light filtered in through a few grimy plastic windows set high in the curved walls, illuminating a cavernous, empty space. The concrete floor was cracked and dusty. My footsteps echoed, loud and intrusive. It was enormous. You could have parked 3 school buses in there. and it was all mine. The sheer emptiness of it was terrifying. It wasn't a shelter, it was just a bigger version of the cold. My hope, which had been a flickering candle flame, was instantly snuffed out. This was impossible, a monument to a dead man's folly and my own desperation. My eyes scanned the vast, empty expanse, looking for anything. And then I saw it. Against the far wall, almost lost in the gloom, was a single object. A dark green, military-style footlocker. It was the only thing in the entire place. A single, solid object in a world of echoing emptiness. It was a focal point, a question waiting to be answered. My breath plumed in the frigid air as I walked towards the footlocker. Each step echoed like a drumbeat in the cathedral of cold. It was an old military surplus chest, solid wood with metal-reinforced corners and a heavy-duty latch. It was locked with a small, rusty padlock. Of course it was. Nothing about this was going to be easy. I felt a surge of frustration, a hot flare in the frozen emptiness. I kicked the chest, my borrowed boot thudding against the solid wood. The only result was a sharp pain in my toes and another loud, lonely echo. Defeated, I sank down onto the floor, my back against the cold metal wall of the hut, and stared at the locker. It was a puzzle box, and I was sure the answer to everything, or at least the next step, was inside. My eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, scanning the cavernous space around me. This wasn't just an empty building, it was my grandfather's empty building. He had been here. He had stood on this concrete floor. I started to look not for what was there, but for what a man like him might have left behind. A man who built things, a man who was prepared. In a darkened corner, behind a stack of rotting pallets I hadn't noticed before, I found a small pile of his things. A rusty wheelbarrow, a few empty fuel cans, and leaning against the wall, a long, heavy crowbar. My heart hammered in my chest. It felt like a gift from the past. I carried the crowbar back to the footlocker. It took 3 tries, 3 grunting, desperate heaves before the wood around the hasp splintered and the padlock broke free with a sharp crack. I tossed the crowbar aside and knelt, my fingers fumbling with the latch. I lifted the heavy lid. I don't know what I was expecting. Money, maybe. A survival kit. A weapon. But it was none of those things. The chest was filled, neatly and precisely, with paper. On top was a thick, leather-bound journal. Beneath it were dozens of bundles of letters, each tied with simple twine. And at the very bottom, nestled in a bed of sawdust, were a few well-oiled hand tools. A hammer, a handsaw, a wood plane. It was a chest full of words and work. I sat on the dusty floor and opened the journal first. The first page was dated the year he bought the property. The handwriting was the same as on the cardboard box, neat and controlled. Day 1, it began. Arrived. The hut is a monster, cold and loud. The wind makes it sing, but it's mine. The quiet is real. It's a start. I put the journal aside and picked up the first bundle of letters. I untied the twine. They were addressed to my grandmother, Mary, and they told a story I had never known. He wrote about the war, not in graphic detail, but about the aftershocks, the noise, the crowds, the feeling of being constantly on edge. He had been a combat engineer. His job was to build bridges under fire and to clear mines. He built things to save people, but he was surrounded by destruction. The contrast had broken something inside him. "This place, Mary," one letter read, "it's the opposite of all that. Out here there's no enemy, just the cold and the work. If I can build a warm room in this metal can, if I can make one small spot of order in this beautiful, brutal wilderness, maybe I can build a quiet room inside my own head, too." I read for hours, my fingers growing numb, the light from the grimy windows fading as the afternoon wore on. I learned about his first winter, about his mistakes, his small triumphs. He described the feeling of splitting wood until his arms ached, the satisfaction of a well-built shelf, the way the northern lights looked, dancing over the roof of the hut. He was building a life, one board, one nail, one day at a time. And then I found the last letter. It was different from the others. It was in a sealed envelope, and on the front it just said, "For Leo." My name. My breath caught in my throat. He had written a letter to me. A boy he barely knew. A grandson he must have known, even then, was on a shaky foundation. My hands trembled as I opened it. "My dear Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the world has let you down as I feared it might. I am so sorry for that. I wish I could have been there to shelter you from the storm. But people are not always strong enough. Your parents, they love you. I know they do. But they are wrestling with their own ghosts. And sometimes, those ghosts are too strong. I have watched you grow from a distance, and I see my own restlessness in you, my own fire. I worry that the world will try to put that fire out. I can't leave you money, son. Money is too easy to lose, too easy to waste. It buys comfort, but it doesn't build strength. So I am leaving you this instead. This ridiculous metal building on a frozen piece of land. It looks like nothing, I know. It looks like an abandonment, but it's not. It's a toolbox. It's a challenge. It's a place where a person can find out what they're made of. Everything you need to start is here. Not just in this chest, but in the land. And most importantly, inside you. Don't try to conquer this place. You can't. You have to work with it. Make a small space, a warm space. Defend it. The work will be hard. You will be cold, and you will be lonely. You will want to quit. But if you don't, if you see it through one day at a time, you will build more than a shelter. You will build a home. And more than that, you will build yourself. This is not an inheritance, Leo. It is an opportunity. The foundation is laid. The rest is up to you. With all my love, Grandpa Frank. I finished the letter and the paper fell from my numb fingers. And I broke. The cold I'd been fighting, the fear I'd been swallowing, the grief I'd been ignoring, it all came rushing in. I curled up on the concrete floor, my arms wrapped around my knees, and I wept. I cried for the grandfather I never really got to know, a man who had seen me so clearly. I cried for the parents who couldn't. I cried for the boy I had been, lost and invisible. And I cried because for the first time in my life, someone had trusted me. Someone had believed I was strong enough. The words on the page were a crushing weight and a powerful lifeline, all at once. I'm going to pause the story here for a second, because that moment, on that freezing floor, was a turning point. And maybe you've had a moment like that. A moment where a truth is revealed that changes how you see your entire past, your entire self. It can be painful, and it can be liberating. If this is hitting home for you, if you've ever discovered a letter, or a secret, or a truth that redefined your world, I want you to know you're not alone. Let me know in the comments. We build this community by sharing these moments. Your story matters. Now, let's get back to the hut. The sun had set, and the inside of the Quonset was plunged into a deep, profound darkness. The only light was the faint, ghostly glow of the snowfields outside, filtered through the grimy windows. The temperature, which had been merely frigid, was now plummeting. The cold was no longer just an absence of heat. It was an active, aggressive presence. It seeped through the soles of my boots, up my spine, and into my teeth. The tears on my cheeks felt like they were freezing to my skin. My grandfather's letter was a beacon of hope, but the reality of my situation was a crushing physical force. I was in a giant, uninsulated metal box, hundreds of miles from anyone, with a dying flashlight and a handful of granola bars. The hope ignited by his words began to flicker, threatened by the overwhelming, immediate need for warmth. A blizzard rolled in that night. I didn't see it coming. I heard it. First, the wind picked up, changing its low moan to a high-pitched shriek. It slammed against the metal walls of the hut, making the whole structure groan and shudder. Then came the sound of the snow, a frantic, hissing tide of it scouring the corrugated metal. It sounded like the world was being sandblasted. I huddled deeper into the parka the store owner had given me, my body shaking uncontrollably, a tremor that was part cold and part raw fear. My world had shrunk to the weak, yellow circle of my flashlight beam. Beyond it was a universe of roaring wind and biting cold. This was the low point, the absolute bottom. The despair was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that threatened to suffocate me. My grandfather's words about building something seemed like a cruel joke. How could I build anything when I could barely move my fingers? How could I find strength when all I felt was a profound, bone-deep weakness? The temptation to simply give up was immense. It presented itself as a logical choice. I could just lie down. I could wrap myself in my bags, turn off the flashlight, and let the cold take me. It would be quiet. It would be an end to the struggle. The cold was seductive that way. It promised a deep, dreamless sleep. I found the crumpled bus ticket stub in my pocket. I could still try to leave. If I survived the night, I could walk back to the main road in the morning. I could hitch a ride back to town. I could call the number for Child Protective Services that my school guidance counselor had given me once. I could surrender. I would become a case file, a problem to be managed. It would be humiliating. It would be a defeat, but it would be warm. I weighed the two options in the howling dark. The anonymous, sterile warmth of the system versus the deadly, meaningful cold of my grandfather's legacy. One was survival. The other was a chance at life. For a long time, I was sure I was going to choose survival. I was just a kid. I wasn't a pioneer. I wasn't a hero in some story. I was cold and scared, and I just wanted it to be over. My flashlight beam drifted across the floor and landed on the open footlocker, on the journal. I crawled over to it, my limbs stiff and clumsy. I picked it up, my frozen fingers barely able to turn the pages. I found the section where he described his first blizzard. His handwriting was shakier in this part, less controlled. "The wind is a living thing tonight," he wrote. "It wants to get in. It's testing the seams. I've made a mistake trying to heat the whole space. It's like trying to warm up the entire sky. You can't fight the ocean. You build a boat. You don't fight the cold. You respect it. You make a small space of warmth and you defend it with everything you have. Tomorrow, the work changes. I'm not heating the hut. I'm building a room inside the hut, a fortress, a 10 by 12-foot box of life. That's a fight I can win. A 10 by 12-foot box of life. The phrase echoed in my mind. A fortress. A fight I can win. He wasn't telling me to tame the wilderness. He was telling me to carve out a tiny piece of it and make it my own. He wasn't asking me to be a hero. He was asking me to be an engineer. His engineer. The despair didn't vanish, but it receded. In its place, something else began to grow. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was smaller than that. It was a plan, a blueprint. The choice, which had been so murky and terrifying, suddenly became crystal clear. I wasn't going to lie down. I wasn't going to run. I was going to build. I was going to build a box of life, right here in the roaring dark. I would defend it. That was a fight I could win. I turned to the back of the journal, and there it was. A detailed sketch, drawn with a ruler and a steady hand. It was a simple, brilliant design. A small, freestanding room to be built in the corner of the Quonset, using the hut's own walls as two of his. It had plans for an insulated floor, walls, and a ceiling. It showed the placement for a small wood stove and a chimney pipe that would vent out through the Quonset's wall. It was all there. A step-by-step guide to my own salvation. The blizzard raged for another 2 days. I survived by burrowing. I piled my duffel bags and the empty cardboard box from the storage unit around me to create a pathetic little windbreak. I ate the last of my granola bars, rationing them into tiny bites. I did push-ups and jumping jacks in the dark until I was exhausted, just to keep my blood moving. It was the most miserable 72 hours of my life. But I wasn't just waiting for the storm to end. I was studying. I memorized my grandfather's plans. I read his descriptions of how to insulate, how to frame, how to make a tight seal. I was no longer a victim waiting for rescue. I was an apprentice, learning my trade in the harshest classroom on earth. When the wind finally died down and a weak, watery light returned to the windows, I emerged from my burrow, stiff and starving, but with a new sense of purpose. The world outside was transformed, buried under a deep blanket of pristine white snow. The silence was absolute. The war was over. The work could begin. My first task was a scavenger hunt. My grandfather's letter said everything I needed to start was here. I just had to find it. I started with the rotting pallets I'd seen earlier. I kicked them apart, and underneath, just as I'd hoped, was a stack of lumber. 2x4s and sheets of plywood covered in dust, but perfectly dry and preserved by the constant cold. It was a treasure trove. Against the back wall, hidden behind a sheet of loose metal, I found rolls of thick, paper-backed fiberglass insulation. It was itchy and horrible to handle, but to me it looked like spun gold. The crown jewel of my search was the stove. I found it in a large wooden crate I had assumed was just trash. I pried it open with the crowbar, and there it was, a small, pot-bellied cast-iron stove with a box of stovepipes and a chimney flashing kit beside it. It was brand new, still bearing its factory label. He had bought it and never installed it. He had left it for me. The work was brutal. I had never built anything in my life. The handsaw felt clumsy in my grip. The hammer seemed to miss the nail as often as it hit. My first few cuts were crooked. My first few joints were loose. But I followed the plans. I measured 3 times before I cut once, just like he'd written in his journal. I laid down a frame for the floor, filled it with insulation, and covered it with plywood. That was the first victory, standing on a floor that wasn't bare, freezing concrete. Then I built the 2 new walls, framing them out on the floor and then heaving them into place. They were heavy, awkward things,
I nearly crushed my hand, raising the first one. But when it was standing, a new, small corner of the world had been defined. It was mine. I was running out of food. The hunger was a constant, gnawing ache in my stomach. I knew I had to make a trip back to town. The 2-mile walk through the deep snow was exhausting. Every step was a struggle. When I finally reached the main road, I was covered in sweat despite the freezing air. I was lucky. A pickup truck stopped for me within 10 minutes. It was the store owner. He pulled over, his expression unreadable. "Figured I'd be seeing you," he said, "or finding you come spring. Get in." The ride back to town was silent. When we got to his store, I pulled out my dwindling cash. I had less than $50 left. I bought canned beans, rice, flour, salt, and a big block of lard. Food for survival, not for pleasure. As he was ringing me up, he looked at me. "You putting in that stove Frank bought?" he asked. I was startled he knew about it. "Yes, sir, I am." He nodded. "When you run the pipe, make sure it's a foot higher than the peak of the hut's roof. The wind that rolls over that curve creates a downdraft. It'll push smoke back into your house. Kill you in your sleep if you're not careful." He pushed a small bag across the counter. It contained a fire starter brick and a box of waterproof matches. "On the house. Don't burn the place down, and don't poison yourself." It was the most kindness anyone had shown me in months. I just nodded, unable to speak. "Thank you," I finally managed to say. The trip back was harder, laden with the heavy bag of groceries. But my steps were lighter. That small piece of advice, that simple human interaction, was like a supply drop of hope. I wasn't entirely alone in the universe. Installing the stove was the most difficult part. I had to cut a hole in the thick metal of the Quonset wall for the chimney pipe. It took a whole day, using a drill bit I found in the tool chest to make a series of holes, and then cutting between them with a hacksaw until my arms felt like they were going to fall off. But when I finally pushed the pipe through and sealed it with the flashing and some furnace cement I'd bought, it felt like a monumental achievement. I connected it to the stove, filled it with wood splinters, and struck one of the waterproof matches. The wood caught. A small flame flickered, then grew. I closed the stove door and watched through the small grate as the fire took hold. A slow, radiating warmth began to push back against the oppressive cold of the hut. I put my hands out toward the cast iron, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt true warmth. I sat on the floor of my half-built room next to my little stove, and I ate a can of cold beans. It was the best meal of my life. That night, the temperature dropped to its lowest point yet. I had an old mercury thermometer I'd found, and I hung it outside the door of my new room. I watched the silver line sink lower and lower, past -30, past -40, until it bottomed out at an unbelievable -52 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside my little fortress, the world was lethally cold. The metal of the Quonset contracted with loud, gunshot-like bangs. But inside my 10 by 12 box, it was a different story. I had insulated the walls and ceiling. I fed my small stove every hour. The temperature in my room held steady at a balmy 50 degrees. I sat on my sleeping bag, listening to the wind howl and the metal groan, safe in my tiny bubble of life. I had done it. I had survived the worst the winter could throw at me. I hadn't just found shelter, I had created it. I had built it with my own 2 hands, following the map a ghost had left for me. That night, huddled by the stove, I didn't feel like a lost boy anymore.
I felt like a builder. I felt like my grandfather's grandson. The rest of the winter passed in a routine of survival that slowly, imperceptibly, became a life. My days were structured around the stove. In the morning, I would venture out into the vast, silent cold of the main hut to get more wood from the pile I'd stacked inside. The primary task was always keeping the fire fed. But with that central problem solved, I had time. I had space to think. I finished the room, building a small bunk bed and a table from the leftover plywood. I organized my grandfather's tools, and I read. I read every letter he ever wrote to my grandmother. I read his journal from cover to cover, and then I read it again. It was my only textbook, my only entertainment, and my only connection to another human voice. Through his words, I learned things. I learned about the different types of trees on the property, which ones made the best firewood. I learned how to make snares for rabbits out of wire, a skill that eventually added fresh meat to my diet of beans and rice. I learned about the constellations in the vast, clear night sky. He wasn't just teaching me how to survive, he was teaching me how to see, how to pay attention. The world outside my hut, which had at first seemed like a terrifying, monolithic enemy, slowly resolved into a complex, beautiful system. I learned to read the patterns in the snow, to know when a storm was coming, to recognize the tracks of the fox that visited my clearing every morning. His journal wasn't just practical, though. It was philosophical. He wrote about his PTSD, not as a weakness, but as a recalibration of the soul. He wrote, "After you've seen the world at its most fragile, you can't ever unsee it. Most people spend their lives on a solid floor they never question. A soldier knows the floor is a trapdoor. The trick isn't to pretend the floor is solid again. The trick is to learn to live and even dance on the trapdoor." That idea resonated deep within me. My own floor had given way. My family, my home, my future, it had all collapsed. I could spend my life being angry about it, or I could learn to dance on the trapdoor. Here, in this hut, I was learning the steps. The hard physical labor, the focus required to survive, it was a kind of meditation. It quieted the noise in my own head, the anger at my mother, the fear of the future. I didn't have time for that. I had to split wood. I had to check my snares. I had to make sure the chimney wasn't blocked with snow. The simple, profound necessities of life crowded out the chaos. One day, I found a passage in the journal where he described his decision to leave the hut and go back to the world, to meet my grandmother. "I have built my quiet room," he wrote. "I can take it with me now. It's not in the hut, it's in me. The silence is mine. I don't need to hide from the world's noise anymore." I understood then. This place wasn't meant to be a permanent prison. It was a training ground. It was a place to build the quiet room inside yourself. What I had built inside the Quonset wasn't just a 10 by 12 insulated box. I had built resilience. I had built self-reliance. I had built a new version of myself, forged in the cold and the silence. And then, one morning in late March, I woke up to a new sound. A soft, persistent dripping. I went to the door of my room and looked out into the main hut. High above, on the inside curve of the metal roof, tiny beads of water were forming and falling to the concrete floor with a gentle tick, tick, tick. The thaw had begun. I put on the parka and boots and stepped outside for the first time without a specific, urgent purpose. The sun was different. It had a new strength, a warmth I could feel on my face. The snow was no longer a pristine, hard-edged blanket. It was soft, heavy, and shrinking away from the bases of the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, not just of cold. The world, which had been frozen in black and white for months, was slowly returning to color. I walked to the top of the rise and looked out over the valley. The brutal, beautiful landscape that had been my jailer and my teacher was waking up. I looked back at the Quonset hut, the big, gray, metal monster. It didn't look alien or intimidating anymore. The rust streaks looked like character lines. The new chimney pipe, poking proudly from its side, was a sign of life, a testament to the warmth within. It wasn't a tomb. It wasn't a warehouse. It was my home. I had taken the worst of what the world and the weather could throw at me, and I had endured. More than that, I had built something. I had honored the strange, beautiful inheritance my grandfather had left me. The true inheritance wasn't the land or the hut. It was the blueprint for becoming a man. The future is still an unwritten map. I've made a few trips to town, sold some furs from my traps, and established a cautious friendship with the old store owner, whose name is Sal. I have enough money for supplies now. I have plans. I want to build a real workshop in the hut, like my grandfather dreamed of. I want to install a small solar panel setup. I'm not running from the world anymore, but I'm not in a hurry to rejoin it either. I've found my center here. I've found my own quiet room. If my story means anything, I hope it's this. Sometimes the things that look like abandonment are actually acts of faith. My grandfather didn't abandon me to the cold. He trusted me to find my own warmth. And home isn't a place you are given. It's a place you build. It's the walls you put up, not to keep the world out, but to create a space safe enough to figure out who you are. It's the fire you learn to tend, inside and out. There are so many stories like this out there, stories of survival and quiet strength, of people who had to build their own shelter from the storms of life. This community is where we share them. It's a place for those of us who have learned to dance on the trapdoor. If you believe in the power of these stories, hit that subscribe button. It means the world to me. And in the comments, don't just tell me what you thought. Tell me about a time you had to build your own shelter, literally or figuratively. What did you use? What did you learn? I'll be reading every single one, because your story matters. We're all building something, and we don't have to do it alone.